Hello and welcome to Legislative Impact, and today we will be talking about violence as a public health crisis. My name is Taha Sheikh, and I will be your host for today, and along with me I have Dr. Josh Guitar, Dr. Ketty Fernandez, Nicole Rodriguez, and Dr. Madji. Welcome everyone to the panel.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joshua Guitar. I'm at the Communication Department here at Kean University. My research and teaching interests center upon political communication, critical rhetoric, and media studies.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ketty Fernandez. I'm a professor here in the Department of Criminal Justice. My area of research primarily focuses more on violence against women and human trafficking with an emphasis on racial and ethnic inequalities.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Madji from the College of Education. I'm here at Kean University, and my work centers around issues of language, literacy, race, power, and education mostly in minoritized communities in the U.S. and abroad.
Hello, my name is Nicole Rodriguez. I am currently the director for the Office of Accountability Standards in Education, which is formerly known as the Office of Community Standards and Student Conduct. I primarily deal with educating students about our core community values, as well as making sure that they have due process when they violate our student code of conduct.
Awesome. Well, once again, welcome everyone to the panel, and let's get this thing started. A 2021 study in the Journal of American College Health found a positive correlation between college students' exposure to adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and whether they were victims of physical, sexual, or psychological violence or stalking. And this question we could start off with Dr. Fall. My first question is, why are people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences more prone to becoming victims of violence themselves?
Thank you, Taha. So this is a great question, and I'd like to place it in the context of minoritized communities in the U.S. Mainly. And so the answer to the question is, folks with ACEs who happen to be also minoritized do not get the support that they need. And one of the few reasons that I could name to start with would be the fact that they are typically racialized and ethnicized, which really means that they are assigned a certain race and a certain ethnicity, not necessarily the one that they may align with, but this is what happens. And in that case, those folks who are assigned a certain race and ethnicity are treated unequally because of that race of ethnicity, right? And so when this happens, we tend to have those folks placed in one bag, and therefore their needs in society, specifically in this case their mental support needs, are not regarded or considered the right way, because it's this whole race needs this one thing, and if you are a certain individual, whatever you need particularly really doesn't matter. There's also the issue of the dehumanization of certain groups in the U.S. We've all heard things like, you got it. You guys are strong. You can deal with this, right? And so we want to think about examples such as cases where, for example, just to think about one small group, Black women in ERs maybe dying because their diagnosis wasn't taken seriously, right? Or people with mental health crises who are not, or in pain, who are not prescribed the right type of medication, at least not the proper dosage of the medication, or nothing at all, right? And so it's this way of thinking about certain groups is not human enough to be catered as humans. And the last point I want to make about this question is the tokenization that has been evidenced in research when it comes to certain minoritized groups, and I'll explain this in a few words. Health research and other types of research have been known to perpetuate isms in society, racism, linguicism, or language discrimination, right? And so in those cases, when we do research in order to answer this particular question that you asked me, to find out how to cater to people with ACEs, for example, we want to make sure as researchers, the community of researchers that I am part of, that we make sure that we consider all basically that we choose the right subset of the population we want to study. So typically, some types of research has been known to only choose the most integrated or the most Americanized part of that subset of the population, therefore really ignoring the large majority of that group, and therefore missing out on cultural, religious, traditional considerations that would really give us the answers that we need.
Right. And so would anyone else like to add on to that?
I think a bigger issue as well, and kind of piggyback on the issue with how us as researchers are identifying or just, picking our participants or subjects who we want to study and, really understand what's going on, with the relationship between ACEs and victimization. I will say, as a victimologist, criminologist, a lot of studies tend to just focus on white versus others or white versus non-whites. So, it's great, right? We have that information, but we can't compare everyone, to the majority group. When you start talking about research, how, white participants are usually referenced as the majority. So, when you start really looking at, what are potential life outcomes, what are potential, this specific question was, why are individuals who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, why are they more likely to be victimized? And it's one of those questions where, it's a great question. It's a heavy question that we really truly need to unpack, but we can't really just put everyone in a bubble where it's white versus non-whites. If you're really going to start talking about marginalized communities, whether race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sex, whatever it is something that just us as researchers really need to have that conversation of, how are we identifying? Who do we really want to understand? Do we really understand the lifelong trajectories of outcomes of, children really experiencing, adverse childhood experiences? When you start talking about college students, for example, a lot of times, we don't know where our students are coming from, and as a professor, we might just walk into the room and assume that, I can talk about X, Y, and Z and everyone will have, but I don't know what their childhood was like. Were they living in poverty? Were they, are they part of the foster care system? Was it a single parent household, right? So all these different experiences are definitely going to change that trajectory. So where, even as researchers or someone on a university campus, doesn't have to be a faculty or, professor, but just whoever's working with college students, right, really need to understand that there's so much more than what we understand on the college population. When I go back to research, a lot of victimization research, specifically with sexual assault, stalking, a lot of it, right, a huge emphasis of it is on college population. So we're kind of neglecting that general population, right? So, how are we really, there's a lot of information, but we're not really pinpointing and applying it to where, where some groups, some communities may really need. So I think it's something that we definitely need to unpack just as a community, researchers, university staff, whoever really is involved with these individuals.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for those answers. And with that, we can move on to the second question. So first off, Section 1033 of the 1997 National Defense Authorization Act, which is commonly known as the 1033 program, which authorizes excess property of the United States Department of Defense to conditionally transferred to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. And since its inception, the 1033 program has transferred over $7.6 billion worth of equipment to nearly 9,000 participating law enforcement agencies, including tactical and armored vehicles, M16 and M14 rifles, and M1911 semi-automatic pistols. And this question, we can start off with Dr. Guitar, which is, what is the relationship between the use of military-grade equipment and police officers' own conceptions of their roles in the communities that they serve?
Yeah, it's a great question and certainly complex. I'll probably start by peeling it back a layer. So what's interesting about the NDAA in particular is that this is an annual piece of legislation. So Congress authorizes this every year and the president signs it. In the late 80s and early 90s, it was every 2 years, but in the mid 90s, it moved to an annual approval process. And so this language and these provisions get revisited literally every year in Congress. And so I think what's fascinating for me more broadly is that despite calls for police reform, especially after a Michael Brown or the countless issues throughout history, is that despite the calls for police reform happening regularly, that this piece of legislation and this Section 1033 does not get overhauled. In fact, there was a recent, I wouldn't call it an overhaul, it was celebrated as such. The most recent iteration of the NDAA does provide more transparency for what weapons are distributed to police departments, but it doesn't really restrict the process itself. It just creates a little more public oversight, although the language in the law is still, I think, rather opaque. Another part of this is that, we oftentimes, myself included, look back to, okay, where has an ideology of authoritarianism, what's its genesis, how does it build throughout society? Oftentimes we'll look back and say, well, 9/11 is one of those big moments. But this was happening, as you said, in 97, right? So the build-up to some of the legislation we see at the turn of the century, including these new NDAAs and the Patriot Act most famously, are not direct responses necessarily to 9/11, but also Oklahoma City bombing, the Atlanta bombing, and the Olympics. So there's this kind of build-up, and we see it continue even with problems of unrest, particularly in racialized settings, police violence, and what have you. So I think that this problem is not like these what I'll call an ideology of authoritarianism, right, where there's a centralization of power, or that we deem authority figures as having a position of power. These ideologies work both on a top-down level, right, from like federal legislatures to local municipalities, but they also manifest in an organic way. So we perpetuate them oftentimes ourselves without knowing it, and so we'll funnel power to institutions through just common discourse. In fact, a project I'm working on right now with a research assistant here at Kean is analyzing news discourse, looking particularly at the word suspect, right? So suspect doesn't necessarily imply guilt as a term, right? But the way it's used in news discourse does imply guilt, right? That the suspect was apprehended, the suspect is at large. Coincidentally, when police are accused of using violence potentially in a criminal manner, right? The word suspect is we found one instance where it was used, right? So I think that there's a confluence of things, right? On one end, we have a federal legislature who is continuously funneling, weapons to police forces, local municipalities, which oftentimes those members of those forces, the only requirement is a high school diploma. And that's not to disparage persons with high school diplomas, but there's no cultural training, there's no advanced education in terms of how to manage difficult situations, right? And then on the other end, there's a common discourse that we all engage in and are complicit in that continues, without us realizing it, funneling power toward authority, institutions, and people. So to get to more central to the question, and all these things kind of work together to we default to recognizing officers in these situations with military-grade materials to be the authority figure regardless of the situation, right? So this in turn means that you can't not be affected by that, right? As a member of law enforcement and as a citizen, right? Walking into a difficult situation where emotions are high, there's something, there's already enough power imbalance to make persons who are accused of crimes wary of police, right? There's a long history of police violence, and so the tensions are already high just based on history, and now you add military-grade weaponry, which, and there's good psychology research on that to demonstrate how that also elevates the situation. Long story short, to get to the center again, is that there are a lot of pieces of this that channel power toward authority figures, oftentimes who have not been either trained or shouldn't have. We shouldn't be we need to, let me backtrack. We need to address how these ideologies of authoritarianism are manifest, how they manifest, and how they are perpetuated by us without realizing it.
So this question is, again, open to everybody else. Is there any add-ons that anyone would like to add to Dr. Tar's statement?
Yeah. I was thinking when while Dr. Guitar was speaking about the question of who becomes a police officer in the U.S. We know that many police departments around the country prioritize the hiring of military veterans, right? And so there's now a concern about, well, there's should be an adjustment, right? An adjustment in the way that individuals think about their role, their training, and definitely their mindset, right? Coming from war zone to now serving a local community is quite different. And so the question becomes, is that adjustment truly happening in those communities? And what is being done to support our military veterans, just, who decide to serve our local communities?
And even just to follow up that, she said a key word, serve our communities. And I think that is one of the things that is not reinforced when individuals are training for the police departments. Is their job is to serve the communities that they are in. And unfortunately, the use of this weaponry in, local communities, it sets a precedent, right? And the wrong precedent is that I have authority over you, and unless you do what I say, these are the ramifications or consequences of it. But if we were to get back more to that philosophy of community policing and what that truly means, then I think as a society we'll be moving in a better direction. I'll answer my question a little bit later, but it also falls into play with the cultural competencies of the police in our communities.
Yeah, definitely. And we can use that to segue into our next topic of discussion, which is gun violence. And according to the Gun Violence Archive, which defines a mass shooting as one of in which at least one of 4 people are killed or injured. And 131 mass shootings have already occurred in the United States in 2023. We can start this question off with Dr. Fernandez. What accounts for the uniquely severe extent to which mass shootings are perpetrated in the United States?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's a loaded question, right? There's a lot to unpack there. I think simply just to start off, we can go back and look historically speaking how this country was built, right? If we really want to go back to, what guns look like back then versus what guns look like now, so just that historical context of what the U.S., how the U.S. was built. But currently, mass shootings now, right, is the hot word, hot buzz, right, of everywhere. Every day we're seeing something going on. But I think part of it, there's just so many different layers. But one of them that really truly just calls my attention, right, is more of that distorted belief, kind of perpetuated by the media that there's this correlation of mental illness with gun violence. And it's one of those things where it's just constantly said, right, it's mentally ill, and when you start looking at research, that's not necessarily the case. We see that most of the mass shooters, they're not mentally ill. When you start looking at the population of the mentally ill with severe mental health illnesses, a very low percentage of them are actually violent. So if you really want to talk about gun violence and that correlation with the mentally ill, then that's a separate conversation of suicide. That's a high percentage that we're seeing with the mentally ill, right? We know that guns are the number 1 weapons used. You can easily get a gun, right? It's going to vary different, by states and stuff, but this distorted belief of it's just a mentally ill. That's not necessarily the case, right? So we're perpetuating this stereotype as well. With media too, this idea of it's the lone wolf. Oh, nobody knew, right? That's not true either. We also see, there's warning signs. There's, the time before varies, but there's always warning signs, right? So whether it's school shootings or public shootings, right? But the other thing too with mass shootings is, we have to talk about the correlation between mass shootings and domestic violence, right? Family mass shootings. That's a high percentage, right? Where there's a lot of cases of mass shootings that are somehow related with domestic violence. So when we start talking about, how is this exceptionally, uniquely American, right? We can talk about historical context. We can talk about the access. We can talk about gun laws, again, varying by states. But, when we start comparing the U.S. to, comparable other high-income countries, we're seeing that gun violence here in the U.S. is it's just completely different. We're talking about gun-related homicides in the U.S. are about 26 times higher than comparable countries overseas. So when you really start looking at the differences with what's our gun-related homicide here in the U.S. compared to other countries, that's comparable, right? We're not talking about specific countries where there might be civil wars and whatnot, just very apples to apples. Our gun laws are severely different. Our culture is very different. So this whole push of with gun control and the Second Amendment, I think there's just a bigger conversation to have about that, because it's not so much of, nobody should have guns, period, right? Guns shouldn't exist. That's not necessarily the argument. It's just stricter, a stricter, more gun control, So kind of, you also hear this argument of some people will bring up, well, even if we have stricter gun controls, right, there's always the black market. Okay, yes, but also, are we really, when you start looking at mass shootings, a lot of these guns, they were purchased, right? So, again, depending on states, whether you do the background check, 3 days waiting period or whatnot. I think here in New Jersey, I just relocated, but here in New Jersey, it's a little stricter than, for example, a state in Florida, right? Not saying anything wrong about Florida, but, you're going to see differences in that sense. So I think there's just a bigger conversation to really have about that, and really kind of dismantling stereotypes to begin with, right? That it's not the mentally ill or the lone wolf, or this stereotype that we kind of just created ourselves through the media. So there's a lot to just really unpack with that.
Right. And is there any comments from anyone else that wants to add on to it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very interesting when the first thing that comes out of our mouths, or the first thought, is gun violence is related to mental health. I think that's a distraction to the real issue, which is the gun laws, right? Mental health is important, and it's an important factor to consider. But I also think we need to look at the trauma, right? And being informed of what that looks like and what has happened to that individual, whether or not we be able to prevent these types of shootings in the future. But I think if, tougher gun laws is what's going to assist us or move us in the right direction with that. I think it's a big distraction, because that's the first thing people talk about. And it's, studies have shown the mentally ill most of them are not violent. Majority of them are not violent. And in most cases, the people who have been committing these mass shootings haven't been violent at all in their past. They actually kind of work up to these mass shootings. It's just a sad situation, but I think the mental health issue is a big distraction to the real issue.
Absolutely. And since we're on the topic of mental health, we can use that to segue into our next question. A 2014 study in psychological services published by the American Psychological Association found that people of color who were survivors of domestic violence sought some sort of mental health care at the same rate as the white victims of domestic violence, but they were less likely to return to their appointments than their white counterparts. A lot of people, a lot of mental health professionals, they find that it's the lack in training and in mental illnesses, which is expressed amongst different groups. And I guess this question can come back to Mrs. Rodriguez, which is what role does cultural competence training for mental health professionals play in preventing and reducing violence in urban communities?
Yeah. Not only mental health professionals, but also the police, right? I think most of our urban communities only require that the police live in those communities for 2 years before they're allowed to move into another, probably more affluent neighborhood. And I think that's the piece that's missing, because if you're not living in the community that you're policing or serving, there's no real vested interest. That's my opinion. But as far as, cultural competence, most of our urban communities are, culturally diverse. And more often than not, those serving those communities need to have an understanding of what that cultural competence is. Not only that, but even when we're looking at medical disparities, right, and doctors not being informed of diseases or afflictions that afflict a certain population of people. And not understanding that medications may affect them differently. That's why I think you talked about that earlier. It's the same thing with mental health. And some of the reasons why, these individuals are re-victimized is they're very rarely moving away or out of the communities that they are living in or the homes that they have come from. Even in looking at the student population that we serve, for our residential community, they're here from September to May, but then they're going back into the homes that they're coming from, and we don't know what that looks like. I think even through COVID, when we were all forced to stay at home, looking at the limited resources that our individuals have, and the rise of domestic violence. Now that you're forced to be in a home with your with your assaulter, 24/7. The rise in child abuse and molestation and rape. I mean, all of those numbers have increased because these individuals can't get out of these neighborhoods and homes of where they're from. But mental health professionals, police, even the folks here at Kean University, especially for those in the Division of Student Affairs, we have to be very aware of the impact of where our students come from, what things look like culturally, because what would work for me in my home and my culture may not work for you, and I need to have an understanding of that, to have an unbiased conversation with you about it. And for me also, understanding my interviewing when I'm taking students through a student conduct process has to be trauma informed. Like, I have to understand what traumas or what has happened to this person in their past that have brought them to this moment. And the same for our mental health practitioners, right? I think a lot of our, our student population here, most often are suffering from, stress and anxiety, the pressures that are put on them to obtain a college degree and the financial impact of that. So understanding, culture, where our students are coming from. Also, we serve a population of students not from this country, so we have to understand what it's like to not be American in America. So absolutely. Police and mental health professionals, again, it's very important to understand. And now where that training comes from, that's the question of the day. How do we reinforce that? But I think taking little moments like this to talk about it, to bring attention to it. I also work very closely with our own police department here at Kean University, in understanding that now they have to sometimes shift because, policing or serving a college community looks very different than serving, or policing a regular community, maybe like the city of Elizabeth or the township of Union. And even that varies, right? Because, Elizabeth is considered a city, Union is a town, and then the population of people, just the numbers of people in each place. It looks really different. And I think having an understanding of where our students are coming from, the diversity of our students and where they're coming from plays a critical role in how our police deal with our students, and I think in general in society.
Absolutely.
Is there any additions that anyone would like to make?
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I wanted to just focusing for a moment on just the mental health professionals. I'm someone whose part of my job is to train people in cultural competence. And I found myself as a professional training my own therapist at times, right? See the irony in this, right? Because if you look at who belongs or resides mostly in urban communities and who's, what's the population, who is part of the mental health professional group in the U.S., there's a huge cultural gap. So we have to figure out how to really address that gap, right? So going back, I'll share a little African adage. I don't know the exact wording, but it says something along the lines that if you want to help me truly, you want to help me the way I want to be helped, right? In the way that is really concerned with what I need, right? I spoke with a therapist one time and mentioned my mother, and she said, "But why is she in your home? Just throw her out." And, as somebody who's from my identity, that's impossible. I couldn't just throw my mother out, right? And she thought, well, she can be in her own home and just live away from you. I don't know why this is an issue. So something like that really speaks to the fact that as a professional, I found myself even training my own therapist. That's not my job as a patient, right? And bringing it back to another example, I've had, where I reside, a firefighter and police officers actually respond to an alarm, a fake alarm. So there was no fire, there was no danger in the home. It was already established with the police officer who first showed up in my home. But the firefighter had a bit of an issue with me saying, oh, excuse me, can you put these booties on because we don't allow shoes in our home and there's no danger. The police officer had spoken with him and he gave me attitude and he stood there firmly that he was going to walk into my home with his shoes until I had to find myself in another situation where I had to a mini training in a conversation, diplomatic conversation with this firefighter to explain to him what I really meant and what my need was at the time. It's not the responsibility of the patients to go through that. I think it adds to the trauma, it adds to the violence, it adds to the pushing back against who you are and your identity, and it adds to the fact that some minoritized communities or many minoritized communities, even with those folks we need to work with, we need for our safety and protection in the communities we live in, we feel like we don't belong when we do. So that's, I think you made great points.
And I think Dr. Qatar even talked about the language that we use, right?
Mm-hmm.
The terminology's suspect, right? I think the language that we use, the words that we say carry a lot of meaning in how people interpret that, right? And it isn't a bad thing to ask, how can I help you? And I think that's one of the, maybe we view it as a weakness to not know, because if I'm a therapist, I'm supposed to know how to help this person. But sometimes it's just as that simple where you have to ask those questions, how is it that I can help you? And that's such a great point, with the shoes and, people who come into our homes, even just regular service people, they have to understand, right? Everybody has different values, and it could be a religious thing or just a health and safety thing. But understanding that, and it's not even just based off of my skin color or what I look like or what you perceive me to be. It could just be that just simply asking that question. It's really important. And I think, as educators, it's very important that we, reinforce having students go into these fields, right? Because what tends to happen is that now there's nobody that looks like me. And I have to really seek and search for people who look like me to help me so that I know that they're going to get it. They're going to understand that. And unfortunately, right now, that's just the world we live in. And until we get to that point, we will just continue as educators to educate as best we can and make sure that, our police and firefighters and our medical and health professionals, get that training that they need to serve us.
Absolutely. And with that, we can move on to the final question for today. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using a problem-oriented policing strategy, which would use the acronym SARA, which is Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment, to approach violence prevention and reduction, as compared to using a socio-ecological strategy, which considers a broad spectrum of detriments of violence, such as racial or ethnic inequities, high rates of firearm use, ACEs, and mental health? And this is a question that's open for the entire panel.
That's a really loaded question.
I know, there's so much.
You look like you were really about to answer that.
I can start. So I understand why, problem-oriented policing, right? It's supposed to be more reactive, it's supposed to be, more objective in that sense, right? Scan, assess, whatever. I think it's just one of those things where every community communities overall are going to have different needs. So potential solutions for their needs might not look the same across communities. So to have this very one, problem-oriented policing and this is it applied to everywhere, everyone, that's not necessarily fair, right? Because again, that's going to vary across communities. But on the other hand, we as a whole, we have to give credit to police officers because they serve different hats, right? So, for example, if you have a domestic violence case, police officers usually are the first ones to, attend to the victim. And police officers aren't trained mental health professions, right? Professionals, they're not, they might not pick up on certain things, right? If we're talking about, for example, non-fatal strangulation cases, of intimate partner violence, right? When they get there, if they're not trained to really pick up on, the physical, the symptoms that the victim might have potentially just been strangled, didn't pass, didn't die, you might miss that. So, or if they're dealing with someone who is in a mental health crisis, they're not trained trauma personnel to really deal with that. So then we have situations where they might deal, they're coming with this objective of scan, assess, whatever the case may be, and we see that there is an effect on it. It does reduce crime in certain areas, but, if you're getting called to this scenario where someone might be in a mental health crisis, that can very easily escalate to, consequences that we've seen throughout the years. There was a recent case just, around the area where person was in mental health crisis. How do you really address that? How do you really deal with that? So we know police officers, it is a stressful job, it is a dangerous job, right? But at the same time, you really have to understand who you're serving and protecting. You really have to understand trauma, a community trauma in Hudson County, for example, around 9/11 may not be the same trauma that you might see, I don't know, in Washington, right? There's just, you can't compare the two. So I think it's one of those things where there's a lot to unpack and just really understand what police officers go through, and then also understand that realistically speaking, how do we really combine the two, in the sense of responding and, potentially helping the community and moving forward in that sense.
And at the end of the day, they don't know what it is or the scenario that they're walking into, right?
Exactly.
I commend our firefighters and police officers because they're running towards the danger while everybody is running away.
Yep.
So not knowing what it is that you're walking into, the angst that has to create for that individual, right? I think it's a good way to go into a situation because maybe you need to look at it, you need to assess, and this is something that they really have to do. How long do they really have to get to do this? It's not like 10 minutes. It's probably within seconds, right? That they have to quickly assess a situation to determine how it is that they're going to respond. But going back to understanding the needs of the community and where it is that they're going, it's, even having these, mobile units that kind of go around and respond to things rather than having the police, go in initially, kind of like, I'm going back to like, on TV, they have like these crisis mobile units that go and maybe they're familiar with a person who takes medication and it's okay, we know that guy, and we've gotten 911 calls to that house many times. Let's go there and assess that. Just kind of having an understanding what is it that we need to look for when we're going into these types of situations. Honestly, and it isn't any different on a college campus. There drugs and alcohol exist, and these are things that people are going to push the bar and engage in. And when you're going into a situation, you don't know how that alcohol or drug is going to affect that person, and going into that space where it might be going on or whatever. However they're responding, it's a difficult situation. But in any case, understanding the needs of that community and staying in touch, right? I think one of the great things that I'm noticing even in this community with our police officers here is that they're out and about more, getting to know students and having sit downs with them in the cafeteria or having a cup of coffee, or even being at our open houses. Now I'm even seeing them engage more with students that are potential to come here. They're to say, hey, yeah, we have a police department here, and we want that type of engagement, and I'd rather it be a positive one than a negative one. So engage with me before something becomes a problem. And if this is done more in our local communities, where you're seeing, the same officers or driving around in their cars, engage with them more. Sit down and have a more casual conversation rather than one that's, adversarial. Because I think that might be one of the ways, a good ways into getting, more better communication. But understanding that it is important to know and understand the communities that you're serving. Know the people. I mean, I know it's hard, right? You can't know everybody, so I'm not saying that, but we all know, different communities have different needs. You brought a very good point up about those cities and towns near New York when 9/11 happened. May not have had the same impact as those communities in South Jersey. The impact of it was all the same. Everybody was, traumatized by that, but the needs of those communities along the river are a lot different than the ones that are a little bit further in. And responding to something that is this something that's still traumatizing them from 2001 that we need to know about now? I'm pretty sure people are a little bit more reactive, and we're all different. Different things that happen in society, these mass shootings and all, they change us. COVID, it changed us, and it changed the way we react and respond to people. And it's up to those people that serve the communities to protect us. It's their job. They have to step up.
Absolutely. You both make very good points, and I wanted to add just going back to the importance of our first responders, whether mental health professionals or police officers and firefighters, their importance, and in many cases, in most cases, their bravery as they go into our communities and protect and serve us. I think it's important to also recognize the dangers of just a socio-ecological approach rather than thinking about both, as you said, Dr. Fernandez, recognizing that a problem-solving approach may also be necessary, as you're saying. Mm-hmm. But I think with that said, though, we have to talk about awareness. I talk about this with my grad students a lot. I talk about teaching, for example. My students are grad students who are teachers in very savvy teachers in our classrooms, and discuss with them how teaching is not neutral. Providing a service of that sort, teaching, responding to emergencies, it's still not neutral. You're coming in within a certain body, within certain philosophies that were learned as a child, as an adult, things you've acquired as a human being. And so therefore, the awareness of the folks you are going to serve is extremely, it's critical. It's extremely important, right? When our first responders go into communities, we have to, as part of our communities, I don't know if this is through training, this is through conversations, but whatever the case may be, our first responders need to know the social, the political, and the historical underpinnings of creating a community, of developing a community, and of sustaining one. So when you're walking into a situation, you're not just walking into a home, you're walking into a community of people. There's history there, there's political beliefs, there's cultural things going on, social things happening at a time. And it's extremely crucial for our first responders to not only be aware of that, but to be continuously trained and continue having these conversations with community members who are best suited to tell them who they are and what they're expecting from them, and also for the first responders to be able to explain to them, what their presence means and how they're expected to be viewed in those communities. I think this is just a very important conversation we need to continue having.
Absolutely. And with that, if we don't have any other closing statements, that is it for today's episode. I would like to thank all of our panel guests for coming out here today and for joining me to discuss violence as a public health crisis. And thank you guys so much for watching.